I grew up in Utah.
Okay, folks, please take a seat. We're going to get started.
Right next door, huh?
Hello, can you hear me?
You're not a Mormon, are you?
No, they say, am I an immigrant? I said, no, but I'm an alien because I grew up in Utah.
That sounds on. Is this on? Yes, this is on.
No, that's...
Folks,
No,
we're going to get started.
On every score. I'm non-white, I'm not Mormon, I'm the whole bit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Rosenblum. I'm a professor here at Northeastern, and I want to welcome all of you here to this plenary session of Beyond National Security, Immigrant Communities and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This is our second day. We have a stellar group of activists and attorneys and scholars who have gathered here for 2 days. And we've been meeting. We had a plenary yesterday, and we've also been meeting in a number of small group sessions to talk about the economic, social, and cultural rights of non-citizens and to hammer out a set of principles that we're calling the Boston Principles that we hope will then make its way out into the world and be signed onto by state and local governments, by many different actors. So I want to welcome you all here today, and I'm just going to very briefly say a few thank yous and then give it over to our moderator here to take it away for the plenary. This is, with all such efforts, there's a huge amount of work that goes on behind the scenes. It's not the folks you see up here, but it's the work that makes this all happen. And I just want to take a moment to praise the really extraordinary efforts of, particularly of Mariah McGill, who brought this together. She's a fellow. She's a fellow at the Program on Human Rights and the Global Economy. I also want to thank Janice Galligan, Jane Moyson, and Jackie Davis, all of the student volunteers, all of the staff. It could not have happened without you. Thank you very, very much. And now I'm going to introduce our moderator for today. Arti Shahani is a journalist. She covers a lot of immigrants' rights issues. She is also currently a Soros Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And she also has a past life that I'm not going to let her get away with without mentioning, which is that she was the founder and for many years the executive director or the co-director of Families for Freedom, which is a really visionary, groundbreaking grassroots immigrants' rights group in New York. So she brings a lot of experience and skills to this, and she'll be introducing the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Hi, how's everyone doing? Good? You're awake? I'm worried I see a lot of food, which could mean a lot of naps right after. And so we're basically here for an hour and a half, and so if you need to take a break, then it's after that. So my name is Arti. As Rachel mentioned, I'm currently a freelance journalist. I'm also a graduate student, and in my prior life, which still feels like very much a part of my present life, I was an immigrant rights organizer, really focused on people who were being deported from New York City. And so I followed, you could say, immigration as a policy debate, as a political issue, and as a real-life human, not so much issue, but struggle for people for over a decade now. And when Rachel gave me the opportunity to moderate this panel, I was especially excited about it because the hope in our conversation right now is to not just do a mapping of how bad things are, what we have to mourn, why things like a general sort of attrition is happening against communities across the country, but in fact to actually seize on the wisdom of the practitioners that we have over here to really understand what does intervention look like, what does meaningful intervention look like. I get the sense if you're in this room, it's because you actually already know a lot about these issues. You're not starting green, but perhaps you already know what the laws in 1996 were when they passed. Perhaps you personally know, have represented, or work with people who have been deported. Maybe you're involved in an electoral campaign right now, and so you bring your own experience to the table. So what I propose as a format for right now is to have each of the panelists get only 6 minutes to answer a question that I present to them that's grounded in the work that they're doing. And then after that, I'll try to facilitate a bit of conversation between the panelists. If I do my job well, there will be some tension and some disagreement. And then we'll open it up to the floor for some Q&A discussion, all right? So that said, I want to go into talking with our first panelists. I'll do introductions of each panelist right before they ask them their question. Our first speaker is going to be Paul Watanabe. He's a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He also has a lot of other affiliations with the U.S. Sensory Advisory Committee on the Asian Population, with the NISE Student Relocation Commemorative Fund, with the American Civil Liberties Union. He's known locally as being an expert and a commentator on a lot of campaign and electoral issues as well. And so given that we're in campaign season, we're about to have elections, I was hoping that Paul would speak about how has immigration been framed either in a specific Massachusetts campaign or more broadly in other parts of the country, whether you're looking at a state level, county level, whatnot. How do you see it being framed? Has any candidate moved a pro-immigrant agenda in the process of campaigning or not, or has it only worked in the Tea Party direction? So if you can start with that.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks for attending. Look, my comments are going to be very general and not highly nuanced in 6 minutes. For the 60-minute talk, you can maybe get a lot more detail, but I'm going to try to be bald and general, and maybe I think much of this you know about. In terms of the question about what's happening in terms of the political situation within this electoral climate, look, on balance, in terms of the pro-immigrant, and I know these are generalizations, but I think you understand, in terms of the pro-immigrant forces, they are clearly almost solely on the defensive. In terms of the anti-immigrant forces, they are clearly and strongly on the offensive. And so I want to focus in my comments on the offensive. Among the pillars, I think, of that offensive, there are a number of them. One of them is the anti-Muslim nature of it. It's amazing how that's become such a broad and acceptable theme in the politics of 2010. Look at just some of the ads that are out there. Look at the woman running for this, I think it's the 2nd Tennessee District, Elmers. Just Google it and take a look at that ad. It's reflective of this anti-Muslim thing. Secondly, I think there, of course, are elements of racism. It's racist in certain elements about it as well. I think Bill Maher, for example, said the other day, I think he captured it very well. There are two things that the Tea Party doesn't like. One, they don't like being called racist. And second, they don't like black people. That in some ways there is this, and it reflects a broader theme, of course, but the composition of immigrants, the composition of our nation itself as it is transforming is, of course, very much a part and related to these elements as well. And assuredly, of course, directly related to immigrants and immigration is the nativist aspects of these pillars. In some ways, it's interesting because I think the attack on Obama is illustrative of this. If you think about, for example, focusing on race, the initial attack, the whole Reverend Wright episode was one that really raised this issue about race and affiliation and who you were and so forth. But then that was followed by the whole issue about citizenship and nationality, the whole birthers thing about now questioning on that particular front Obama in terms of where. And after that one sort of died out a little bit, they just literally moved on to the next one, and that is the notion of his religion that in some ways, and it played out in sort of silly ways and in not so silly ways. The silly ways, the Barack Osama kind of stuff. But also this notion about him being a Muslim. And you say, well, that's kind of silly. Well, polling has indicated that national polling has indicated that up to 40% of the American public believes that he is indeed a Muslim. That in some ways indicates that there's sort of this relentless barrage, and it's tied. It's not just you deal with the issue of race, then you sort of respond to that, then you move on to the issue of his nationality, then you move on to the issue. It's a continue, and I would argue illustrative to some extent about the politics that I'm talking about. In some ways, I think to understand what's going on in terms of, again, this phenomenon, it's not really the language of change, we're familiar with that, in terms of, ironically, Obama. It's the language of revolution, and that's why in some way the Tea Party idea is actually pretty fundamental. It's not talking about changing government. It's not talking about pursuing better policies. It's the language of revolution. It's the language of occupation is what they're concerned about. Who has occupied our country is really very much a part of what it's all about. That in some way, some people have taken over. Immigrants clearly are part of that mix. Gays and lesbians are clearly a part of that particular mix. It's a broad notion, I think. Much of it is the language, and I think it has to be understood, at least in part in those terms. It's not the language of change, getting different people there, getting better policies. It's in some ways the language of revolution. There are other pillars, I think, that are there as well, and they're a lot more specific to the conversation we've been having here over the last 2 days. There is one, of course, there's an anti-federalist strain to it, is one that supports localism. So, as the discussions we've been having here in terms of immigration and enforcement, the ratcheting down to the local level, from the federal level to the state level to even cities and towns in terms of the enforcement of immigration is in some ways reflective. This devolution, of course, is consistent, I think, with this particular strain. Secondly, there's also, of course, the changes to the whole idea of birthright citizenship speak, again, very directly, of course, to the interests of immigrants in this broader tradition that I'm talking about in terms of dealing with diversity, change, race, and its manifestations. There's also this sort of very clearly a third element which I talked about a little bit in the previous session, and this notion about we have to understand everything changed on 9/11. This whole creation of the kind of post 9/11 national security framework, which trumps everything. And to me, to some extent, there of course is a national security issue here. But I think that in some ways, very clearly, that national security framework, as I've indicated, is much more about domestic control than it is about national security. It's the utilization of a national security framework threat as I would call it a fig leaf, as a cover, to promote a much, much broader agenda that is consistent along the lines that I'm talking about. It's also, another pillar is it's anti-internationalist. Again, we've been spending so much of our discussion, and for somebody who's a non-lawyer, a useful discussion, listening to the possibility of using things like the Human Rights Declaration, international law, as a way to think about how we proceed. But in some ways, you have to understand that very much of, again, the push from this side is one that is actually opposed to all of those sorts of inculcations of the notion of international norms and law and influences. And finally, there's a pillar of it, and it's too bad we have to say this at a university, but there's a resistance to the notion of facts and arguments as a way in which to influence people. And a lot of you in a critical legal studies, of course, would agree with the notion if you stop the sentence of resistance to facts and the understanding that in some ways there is a way to interrogate all of those facts. But I think they're looking at this resistance to facts and arguments in a very, very different way. In short, what I think it's interesting, what many of us find appalling, both in terms of ideas and actions, others find reasonable, and we have to understand that. For almost all of us who think something is appalling, others find it as a reasonable response to something. And we also must understand that our possible solutions, the idea of appeal to reason, of human rights framework, etc., is what others find totally offensive and objectionable. That in some ways there's this entire flip in terms of what are causes and solutions. Let me use my last 30 seconds, however, on a potentially useful or positive note. That is, given all of this, I think the purpose is clear. We're not in search for a purpose. Everybody in this room understands the purpose and the reasons why we're here. But of course, we're searching for some sort of answers, and if not answers, at least some inspiration and hope, which are proving elusive, I think, for many of us at least who share my perspective. But I'm reminded of a comment that Salvador made yesterday in a session. He said, is there some way to create this connection between Selma and Phoenix, that's in some respects our challenge? And I kind of thought about that, and I found at least a little bit of a glimpse what might be an answer to it in an unlikely place. I'm reading Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration. I hope you read this book. I'm reading it now. And when I say an unlikely place, one might think about the Great Migration as a source to draw this connection between Selma and Phoenix. But let me end by just reading a paragraph from her book, which I think gives us some sense of inspiration and hope and connection, which is something that may be a way in which to respond to what I've just laid out. She writes, "The actions of the people in this book were both universal and distinctly American. Their migration was a response to an economic and social structure not of their making. They did what human beings have done for centuries when life became untenable, what the Pilgrims did under the tyranny of British rule, what the Scotch-Irish did in Oklahoma, when the land turned to dust, what the Irish did when there was nothing to eat, and what the European Jews did during the spread of Nazism, what the landless in Russia, Italy, China, and elsewhere did when something better across the ocean called to them. What binds these stories together was the back against the wall, reluctant yet hopeful search for something better, any place but where they were. They did what human beings looking for freedom throughout history have often done. They left." Thanks.
Thank you for that, Paul. Our next speaker is going to be Eva Melona, and she is the executive director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Group, MIRA, also means look, MIRA. And she's also co-chair of Governor Patrick's Advisory Council on Refugees and Immigrants. I wanted to have Eva just start off with talking a bit about the situation for undocumented students in Massachusetts. As progressive as the state might be in comparison to others, we don't have in-state tuition for undocumented students. I don't know if you want to just start by talking a bit about the prospects for students in a state that's leading the country in education, and maybe even comment a bit about Massachusetts' role in pushing for Framing the DREAM Act.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this issue. MIRA, as you may know, represent the voice of the foreign-born in the Commonwealth, and we've been around for 23 years and being the lead on immigration at the state level as well as at the federal level. And let me start by saying that a couple of days ago there was a tragedy. This young woman who was in a difficult situation, threw out her child out of the window, and the media didn't really pay attention to the tragedy and to what was happening, but they jumped into saying that do we have to give the right to undocumented to go to school? And isn't it time to challenge the Supreme Court decision and kick everybody out of the country and not let anyone to get education? So this is where we are, unfortunately, at this point in time. And the story is that there are about 300 to 350 students every year who graduate high school, top of their class, with dreams to, pursue higher education. And then at the time that they apply to college, they find out that, they don't have immigration status and they do not qualify for in-state tuition rates, so they have to pay three times more. And there have been attempts in Massachusetts many, many times. Actually, the history goes 7 years ago when the first bill was introduced at the state level in order to allow the undocumented students to pay in-state tuition rates. And the effort failed, unfortunately, every year with the exception of 1 year that the Senate passed it as an outside section of the budget, and year after year. But of course, under Governor Romney, it was promised that a veto was secured if such measure would make both chambers. But unfortunately, only made the Senate, never made the House. And the last time it came up for a vote, when the advocacy community and the student immigrant movement, a wonderful group of individuals who are working very hard and organizing across the state, when we were doing our advocacy and our lobbying within the limits of the 501c3, we were promised that, the votes are there. We'll vote for the bill. It's the right time. And this is 3 years ago. This is the right time to pass the bill. It's the right time for Massachusetts. When Nebraska and New Mexico and Oklahoma and Texas and Utah did it, we can do it too. And it was it was remarkably sad on that day when the vote took place. And those who had promised to us and to the students that we are ready to vote for it said, we understand the issue, we sympathize, but we cannot vote for it at this time. So that was, very, very disappointing. And I remember, the students outside of the Senate floor in tears, feeling betrayed and, feeling hopeless that the bill never made it and the promises were never kept. And then there was an effort under Patrick's administration to look into the issue again. The governor has been consistent, in support of the bill and looked into the ways to doing this administratively, but there were legal constraints for that to happen. The last time that, the legislation was introduced in the Senate and in the House, and both leadership were the sponsors, there were many attempts to change the language and, make it look tough and build more provisions and penalties in it, but there was not enough support to pass the legislation. And in our conversations now with the members of the House and members of the Senate, the one thing that you hear is, voters need to, in all districts, the voters need to make this an issue, that this really need to happen. And if the members, if the legislators don't hear from voters that this is an issue that benefits Massachusetts, it's the right thing to do, and it benefits almost 400 undocumented students every year, it's very little hope that this is going to happen. So I just want to use this opportunity to reach out to you, to work with us and to continue this effort, because the legislation will be reintroduced again. And we'll see after the election the narrative may change, but there may be a chance to work on this and then, come up with the creative ideas as to how we can run. Okay. So very briefly, I'll just cover what's happening at the federal level. The DREAM Act, the federal legislation that addresses this issue, that goes further, that will provide legal status for the undocumented students, that had bipartisan support over the years, also didn't pass. And then recently there was an effort in the Senate to attach the bill to a reauthorization bill for the Department of Defense, and that effort failed, unfortunately, 57 votes for it. And the claim was, well, it was a process because it was an amendment to reauthorization bill, wasn't really on the merits of the bill, but unfortunately, we didn't have the vote of the Massachusetts senator. Senator Brown voted against it. Senator Kerry voted for it. So the prospects are really not good at this point. Given the legislative calendar, it's going to be very difficult to see anything passing at the federal level at this time, but there will be an effort in the state Senate and in the legislature in Massachusetts for the bill to be reintroduced right after the election. Thank you. And I'll stop there.
So Salva Loretha has joined us from Phoenix, Arizona, to share the story of what's happened there, and I guess a cautionary tale for what might be happening more and more in other parts of the country. Salvador is an organizer with a group called Dona Tierra. It's a community development center in Phoenix. He might be better known as the man who Sheriff Joe Arpaio arrested without any cause in July, just to mess with him for his activism. And just by a show of hands, how many people here know what SB 1070 is? Okay, so this is a room that doesn't need the primer. So maybe, Salvador, you could start by telling us a little bit about the organizing that's been happening in Phoenix in particular in response to SB 1070 and then previously Arpaio's raids with 287G, and what are the lessons that people up here in the Northeast need to take away from Arizona that maybe we're not seeing or hearing when we watch CNN?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm happy to be here where the first immigrants to America came on Plymouth Rock. We have been here for thousands of years, and we welcome them with open arms. So, first of all, let me tell you that the best defense is a good offense. And even though he's right that we're on the defensive, it's our own fault. I don't blame anybody but ourselves. We went dormant. In the 60s and 70s, we fought hard. And then we went to sleep. And the right never went to sleep. They kept on working, and they have been organized. They have been doing a very good job. Well, in Arizona, what we did, we fought back, and we're still fighting back. We started fighting back with Sheriff Joe Arpaio using the 287G agreements, which, by the way, is a federal policy, the agreement with local police. Started implementing it at a local furniture store, lending off-duty sheriffs to intimidate and terrorize an entire community. The day laborers were the ones that started this fight. It was not the intellectuals, let me tell you. It was the day laborers that were feeling the direct effects of what was going on, that decided that they didn't care if they got reported, they didn't care if they were harassed, they didn't care, they were going to fight back. And for 3 months, they basically, every Saturday, demonstrated in that furniture store until the store lost $1 million and decided that their ideology was not as strong as their pocket. So they basically let it go and let Sheriff Joe go out of there, and we were able to clean that community from Sheriff Joe harassment. However, he kept on going, and now he has done about 3 dozen raids in the last 3 years in different parts of the city, but the communities too are fighting back. Right now we have about 15 barrio defense committees that are spread out throughout the metropolitan area of Phoenix and the county, and we're actually in Mesa in different places, and what we're doing is we're organizing to videotape Sheriff Joe. We're organizing not only to videotape Sheriff Joe, but also to know your rights. We have attorneys that will take anybody out that defends their rights and do not say they're coming from another country, and they exercise their right to silence. And we promise them their first defense, so we are able to interfere with them as John Doe or Jane Doe. And because they never told anybody that they were from another country, they cannot detain him in Arizona. The minute you say that, you don't have bail. So we've been doing that. We've gotten about 5, 6 people out so far. And we have been organizing not only that, but wherever Sheriff Joe goes, within 24 hours, we can mobilize 300 to 500 people. And it's mostly communities that are doing it. They meet daily, they meet weekly, and we have created an organism that is fighting back not only against Sheriff Joe, but also right now we're mobilizing a lot of people to the elections. In fact, tomorrow we hope to have at least 10,000 people mobilized to go and vote, because we're telling people, you can take your mom, you can take your dad, you can take your lover, you can take your friend. It doesn't matter. If they really love you, they're going to go vote for you. They're U.S. citizens. So we're mobilizing people too. We cannot be sitting down acting as victims. Human rights are not going to come from a university setting to come in and defend us. We really thank all the attorneys that have helped us a lot, ACLU, MALDEF, all of them. But it's actually the people themselves that are fighting back. And because we're fighting back, allies start coming up. Allies start showing up. When we started, it was only day laborers. After a while, it was attorneys, it was doctors, it was the UU or the Universalists, for example, went and arrested, 29 of them got arrested, stopping the raids against, the Sheriff Joe was trying to do on the 29th of July. We had Methodists getting arrested. We had mostly white people getting arrested. A few of us from the community got arrested, if you were a U.S. citizen. But the main thing is the community themselves are beginning to fight back and are beginning to do it in a way where it's very effective, very organized. And I think it's the beginning of a national movement. Right now we have 5 frontline states that are beginning to recreate that form of organizing. They have their Tea Party, so we're going to have our barrio defense committees. And basically, we have them now in New Orleans, in Miami. We're going to move to Virginia, North Carolina, and actually to Tennessee. And we're going to go wherever wherever the right wing is attacking us, we're going to attack back. But we're going to do it smartly. We're going to mobilize voters, and we're going to exercise human rights. Now, Sheriff Joe is, right now we have him on the defensive. They put his top chief on timeout. and 2 or 3 other people on timeout. He claims he doesn't know anything about it. But the thing is, once you allow this type of laws, and don't take away the blame from the federal government, they are responsible through their 287G agreements, the secure communities, and by having our ex-governor, Jana Napolitano, as Homeland Security, for what's happening today. And they're about to do to you guys what they did to Arizona at the national level. So wake up, be part of the movement, start organizing your committees here, and I'm sure my time is almost up, but I'm sure that if we do organize together at a national level, we can change a lot of things. We have to stop being victims. We have to stop saying, oh, it's so bad, it's so bad, it's so bad. You know what? If it's bad, roll up your sleeves and start fighting back. Nobody's going to fight for you. Thank you very much.
Rinku Sin is the executive director of the Applied Research Center and the publisher of their magazine Color Lines. I strongly suggest that people here go to Color Lines, look at it online. It's a fantastic online news source, both as a model of the types of engagement you can use and do for internet organizing, as well as just great content. Color Lines recently, or rather the Applied Research Center recently decided to launch a very interesting campaign that for myself as a writer and journalist really personally appreciated. It's a campaign to get rid of the I word from the media. What's the I word? As in illegal, criminal, alien, terrorist. Right. And so Rinku's going to talk with us a little bit about the genesis of the I word campaign, and frankly, what do you hope to accomplish with it?
Great, thanks. I'm actually going to stand up so I can see folks in this corner over here. You can all hear me, right? Okay, great. So the Applied Research Center is a think tank, a racial justice think tank. We have 3 parts of our program: our media work, which includes original journalism; our research, where we look into how things are playing out for communities of color; and then we have a big network of individuals and organizations across the country who are actually implementing racial equity ideas. So our overarching mission is to popularize racial equity notions and to prepare people to fight for them. So you can sort of see in our program which are the popularized parts and which are the prepare people to fight part. So we began to think about language and its effect on racial politics a long time ago, but particularly in relation to the immigration debate for about 4 years ago. A couple of years ago, in 2008, I was on a tour for a book that I had written with Fekak Mamdou, who is a Moroccan immigrant who worked at Windows on the World in the World Trade Center, and after September 11th, built a new organization of mostly immigrant restaurant workers across New York City. And I was really struck while I was on that tour by this thing that used to happen multiple times. I'd be in a bookstore, Mamdou and I would be in a bookstore, we'd be doing our thing, there would be our smallish crowd at the bookstore. It was, modest. And then over in the edges, maybe behind where we were speaking or kind of off to the side, somebody would be listening, and they wouldn't ever come in and sit down in the center. They'd just be listening at the side. And then when we finished, they would come up to us. They were always young people, and they would say, I just was looking at the art books or the music section, and I heard what you guys were talking about, and I was interested, and I just wanted to tell you, and then their voices would drop to a whisper, and they'd say, I just wanted to tell you I'm illegal, and I'm really trying to figure out what to do. I'm 18, 19, 20 years old. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to be a doctor. I can't work. I can't go to school. And it would all come out in this shameful whisper, and that, I had a really clear intellectual understanding of what our immigration system does to people, but having that happen kind of multiple times in a short span of, in a couple of months really reinforced the message. And it's quite different seeing the person right in front of you telling you this and then watching what happens in their bodies as they're talking. So that kind of experience, which I think all of you have also had, I know all of you have had, really made us begin to think about what do we need to do to reframe the immigration debate so that immigrants themselves are seen as human beings. That seemed to be the essential challenge, so that immigrants can see themselves as human beings, and so that the rest of the country can also see us as human beings. And the I word, illegal, both in its long form, illegal immigrant, illegal alien, and in its shorthand as a noun, illegals, is problematic for us because it equates the act with the person. There is no way to be a bigger person than that act. And there isn't anybody else in the entire system who gets slapped with that kind of label, not the employers, not the human traffickers, not the police officers, not the Joe Arpaios. Nobody else gets called, has their entire being kind of subsumed under their actions in the immigration debate. It also hides the complexity of actual immigration law, which I know you all are really, really familiar with. So when people say, when we used to argue for the word undocumented, we would say that, we do that because it's a civil violation. Well, crossing the border is a criminal violation, right? And being in the country is a civil violation. So right there, it's very clear that even the federal government can't quite decide what's criminal and what's civil. The ways in which immigrants have been denied due process also reflects how the federal government can't decide what's criminal, what's civil. And all of that kind of gets lumped into this illegal label that isn't terribly accurate. And we think that that's a huge problem for journalists in particular, whose job is to be precise and accurate and contextual in their reporting. And then finally, it feeds racial profiling and hate crimes. So our campaign is really focused on getting media in particular to drop the I word. And it has to start with immigrant communities ourselves and with the people who love us. And so the way it works is that we've built a website, droptheiword.com. We are focusing initially on illegals as a noun because it's obviously a slippery slope from the longer terms to the noun. But the noun strikes people who are not like us, that is, people who are not deeply embedded in the fight, as offensive. So, many people can see that there's a problem with illegals as a noun who can't yet see that there's a problem with the entire framework. And so we're using the noun to give us an opening to be able to have the conversation with people and to open up some thinking about, how did this get to be the language? And how would we see immigration if we used a different kind of language? And how do the people to whom these words are applied, how are they actually affected by that language? So we are looking to humanize immigrants, to reframe the immigration debate, to make it clear always that it's human beings and human lives in a very, very complex global system that we are talking about. And our initial reactions have been both positive and getting some pushback. We're getting pushback of the kind of straightforward, they're all illegals, send them all out of the country kind of way that Eva noted. But we're also getting plenty of pushback from progressives, particularly independent journalists, who say, well, there's, illegal immigrant is a facially neutral term, and I would never use the noun, but I'm going to continue to use that. And that's our next bit of challenge. So I'm going to ask everybody here to take one of these flyers, to go to droptheiword.com. You can also sign up on the pledge by texting this number, 69866. They're on the flyer as well, 69866. If we had the time, I'd say just, let's all wait while you took out your phones and did the texting. You're going to text
a legitimate reason to text during a panel.
Yes,
right?
you're going to text I word to that number. And we just started 2 weeks ago. Within 3 days, we had 10,000 shares of the website on Facebook, and that tells us that we're definitely onto something. The buzz is moving, and we need all of you both to take the pledge and to weigh in on that debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Rinku. So our last panelist has a different entry point in terms of the expertise that he offers. Michael Stein is a law professor at William & Mary Law School. He's also the co-founder and executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disabilities. He has an illustrious bio of many places where he's taught and worked and affiliated with. I do want to note he was also a clerk for the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Alito while Alito was in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. The question that we want you to start us off with in terms of answering is, recently the U.S. signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Can you describe why that would be significant for immigrants and refugees in particular, and what do your fellow panelists and the audience need to understand about the utility of international law?
Super. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I always love coming across the river and being with my friends. The CRPD has a couple of articles that are relevant generally for immigrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons, and I won't bore you, I'll save that for my students. But Article 11, which deals with situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies, Article 18 on liberty of movement and nationality, Articles 12 and 13 on equality before justice and access to justice, and Article 32 on international cooperation. And what we're seeing is, beyond the U.S., and we'll come back to the U.S., is countries starting to recognize and use these within their jurisprudence. So both countries that have ratified, we have not ratified, and I hope you'll ask me about that in Q&A, where we work, for example, Bangladesh, South Africa, China, and the Philippines, we will cite to the CRPD, and even if it has not been brought down into national law in a way where you can cite to it as the motivating factor, courts look to it as the operating standard. So in places like the European Court of Human Rights, where I just filed 3 amicus briefs 2 days ago, citing to this CRPD and saying, here is the international standard, the courts are actually taking that into account. I'm told by friends who are working on immigration and disability that they've started to do this. It's been more successful in the asylum area than in the other areas, but courts are starting to take account of it, even if in their opinions they're not actually citing to international standards. They're at least thinking about it and influencing it. Within the U.S., in last July, the Human Rights Watch and the ACLU issued a joint report pointing out that about 15% of those who are being detained as immigrants have some sort of disability that impairs their understanding of proceedings, and they have no right to facilitation, they have no right to lawyers. And so the result of that has been several lawsuits. The result of that has also been at least a handful of cases in which U.S. citizens were deported because they had no right to facilitation, they had no right to a lawyer, and after they hit Mexico and another place, they suddenly realized, well, no, we're actually exporting our people with citizens with disabilities, we send them back. This is nothing new. Under U.S. immigration law, as everyone here knows, you are subjected to a physical and mental exam. And 2 of the questions and bases for denying your status are, 1, whether you are likely to cause damage to other people or to property. And the second one is whether, and this goes way back, whether you are likely to become a public charge. And there's some really wonderful work by Doug Baynton, B-A-Y-N-T-O-N, over at the University of Iowa. He's published 2 articles on it. His book has been forthcoming for a while, and he does really wonderful work. You can look it up. It's called Defectives in the Land, Disability and American Immigration Policy. That really highlights that what we see in other areas and other identity politics is paralleled, even if it comes out in a slightly different flavor. So the idea, first of all, what do we look like? And what does a proper citizen look like may express itself in terms of different colors and different bodily types and different shapes and different genders. But it's still the question of what does a U.S. citizen look like that's still being asked. And the question of who is going to be productive. Using just our eyes, and again, to be very ableist in this, using our eyes, if we can look at someone and say, does this look like someone who's going to be a productive U.S. citizen? Is this someone who can contribute to our society? What we see with the nasty law out in Arizona has been the case for many years with persons with disabilities. And it's, Doug's work illustrates this. People who arrived in this country with work skills, with commitments to work and contracts to work, the inspectors will come and say, oh, well, your one leg is shorter, or you've got a hunchback, or you're blind in one eye. Therefore, you're not likely to be productive, despite people who have already hired you and are desperate to have you work here. So we're going to send you back. And it strikes me that we're having the same sort of dialogue in parallel within different sort of identity politics and configurations, all raising the same sort of issue about what does an immigrant look like and what does a citizen and a valid citizen look like. So let me stop here. As far as last 2 minutes on the CRPD, we have signed it in the U.S. We have not ratified it. I was lucky enough to be at the White House when we announced the signing. I was lucky enough to work with the White House and DOJ and also State Department on putting together the ratification package. But at some point, when they were done asking, as someone who participated in these negotiations of the treaty for 6 years, what does this mean or what does that mean, they pulled the curtains closed. And so what is in the ratification package, what reservations there are, what interpretations, what declarations, I have absolutely no clue. Last July at the White House, the President said that he's very enthused about this and he wants to send it down to the Senate. A couple of weeks ago, I met with number 2 in the State Department, and basically in an answer to him over a private lunch with other law professors about where is the CRPD, his answer was, oh, let's talk about CRC and CEDAW and some other things while we're at it. So where it is, I'm not sure. There's all kinds of interesting politics in the background about who gets to go first to the Senate, whether it's a good thing or not. So let me pause here to keep us on time, and we're all looking forward to your questions and answers and to a good iteration.
Thank you very much. There's an array of expertise here, and I have a few questions that I'll just start us off with and then open it up to more questions from you. Your questions will be better than mine, but I'm here, so I get to start. Obviously we're in Massachusetts in what's an extremely close and heated governor's race. And I was wondering if the people who are native to Massachusetts, who are following the politics here, could comment a little bit about, in particular, how has Patrick tried to organize an immigrant and or Latino constituency? How have such constituencies tried to use his campaign to get certain demands? Either piece of that. I noticed that he came out recently and got a lot of heat for this in the Boston Globe as being against statewide implementation of secure communities being the program that would basically interface local jails with the federal deportation system systematically. It was a move that a lot of media, he took fallout for at a critical moment. So if you could talk a little bit about his relationship to immigrant and or Latino communities in the midst of this election, that'd be great.
Well, again, let me give a shorthand on this. I think it's true in the governor's race in this state, which is close, and other races that I've seen across the country, and this may be a bit of a generalization, but I don't think it's true. My point is not that there are candidates who are supporting immigrants and some of the gains that have been done, nor are there candidates, my implication, who's trying to resist some of the things that I've been talking about. But I can't think of a single case where the result is close. In other words, where there's the race itself is close, where any candidate has pushed any pro-immigrant stances, meaning any significant changes. It's all defensive. In other words, not trying to promote an agenda that is in some ways a response, a positive response against what's being hurled at them. And I think this is true in Massachusetts. For example, with a lot of fanfare, and rightly so, he ran last time for something called a New Americans Agenda, which Ava was one of the chairs. And there was a lot of activity around it, an incredible amount of activity of it, and a thick book of recommendations. Look, I'm going to tell you this, and maybe I'm wrong, and Ava will disagree, but that has not been a part of the Patrick agenda moving forward in a systematic and concerted way. that is what, again, I think that's the nature of the thing. It's the nature of the politics in this particular situation. And those who are likely to take that, potentially take that, are in safe positions, but there's not too many safe positions.
Just quickly to the New Americans agenda. Actually, you know, a lot of credit goes to Governor Patrick. I served under 3 administrations in the council, but he's the first governor who really saw the big picture and, you know, saw immigrants as an asset to Massachusetts and not as a burden. And, you know, half of the PhDs in our state are foreign-born, and the foreign-born population makes up 17% of the workforce. But he's the first one that really saw that big picture. And, you know, when the report was released, 131 recommendations in many areas that require, some areas require resources that are not, you know, available at this point in the area. There are areas for policy change and also areas that require legislative actions. But the governor created a task force right away to look into the report. And the task force came up with some active steps for the administration to implement the report, but it hasn't been really part of the, you know, part of the campaign. And, you know, one of the candidates for governor had a statement a few weeks ago saying that, you know, if he wins, then he will focus only on citizens and not other non-residents. And we called the campaign and said, you know, if there is a misunderstanding, we would like that to be clarified because, you know, we do represent 1 million foreign-born. There are 500 naturalized citizens, 300, you know, green card holders, and there is, you know, a segment of unauthorized or some in the process to get. So we just need a clarification because we're getting a lot of inquiries from the press. And we were told that, oh, yes, maybe there is a misunderstanding there, so we'll correct that. And the statement that, you know, followed was still that I'm going to focus on the non-citizens. So this is the environment, you know, that this election race is taking place. So, you know, I'm just going to say it blank. Is it helpful to talk about the New Americans agenda at this time when, you know, Congress failed to pass immigration reform, when, you know, we're looking into, you know, we're facing economic challenges in a very, very difficult race?
Let me ask one more question now to Salvador. The Arizona Republic and TV news in Arizona very freely uses the word illegals as noun. It's pretty normal there now. Do you think that the I-word campaign could have an effect on the politics, and particularly the media coverage, the way that it shapes people's imaginations there? Or, you know, what's your take on it?
Back in the 1970s, we were able to get the I word out, or the illegal alien word, out of the LA Times, San Diego Tribune. The Arizona Republic wasn't using it anymore. And what's happening today, they're just responding to the climate. And if they get 100 emails or 100 letters, you know, from the opposite side, they might get one from us. So we're not doing our job. That's the basis. This is basically it. We're not doing our job. They respond to pressure and to readership. I think we have to be very creative. When the Dream Walkers went to Arizona, they had a saying said, "I'm undocumented or unafraid." Undocumented and unafraid was the messaging. And we told them, we basically took them into a ceremony and told them, you're not undocumented. You're not an illegal alien. You're not even an immigrant. You are from this Mother Earth. You're a human being. And that's what they went and told Arpaio. And they basically told Arpaio, we're no longer afraid. We are no longer undocumented. We're human beings. And when that came out, a lot of the message people got all out of whack. Oh no, that's not the message. The message is undocumented and unafraid. So first we have to decolonize our mind. If we decolonize our mind, then we're going to be able to do a lot of things. That's why what he was saying today, this is a phrase that was coined by Tupac Enrique, one of the founders of Tonatierra. He basically said, we're going from Selma to Phoenix. We're going from civil rights to human rights. and we're going to the rights of Mother Earth. Indigenous people, the ones that greeted the first immigrants here, they say this: all my relations. All my relations means not only the human, but the whole universe and everything. Even a stone is your relation. And unless we go and actually open that window into humanity, you can play whatever games you want to, and we're not going to be able to change anything, because the other side, which is the dark side, are the ones that are dictating the messaging. So we have to create messages that go beyond strictly. And I think it's good. I mean, we had done it in the 70s. We had done it in the 70s, and it just came back and sweeping us up again. And I think we can take it out, but first of all, we have to change our mind. We have to open that window and leave behind that era, like we left the Dark Ages back in the in the Middle Ages. Then we have to leave out those Dark Ages of today, which is what we're living today. We're living in an apartheid system, and unless we realize that, and unless we know that we're living in an apartheid system, especially in Arizona today, then we're going to continue with this type of messaging.
Let me start opening it up to Q&A in between the questions that I have as well. Who wants to start in the audience? Nope. Oh, there we go. Simple. Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of these questions have gone to political power and how do you build political power on immigrant rights issues. I was in a meeting with some staff, sort of high-level staffers who work on the Hill, to talk about pushing for sort of a human rights agenda. And this one staffer who was completely in support of our issues, said, kind of point blank, there is no constituency for human rights. And then sort of went on to describe from his position as a staffer what a constituency looks like and how we don't have that, right? So I wanted to just get your thoughts on what will it take to build a constituency for human rights or even for immigrant rights, and how you see that in your work.
Can you tell us what he said a constituency looks like?
Yeah. So he said a couple of things. He said a constituency is consistent, right? So he described on other issues this idea of the constant knocks on their doors, right? Specifically on human rights, he said, I can count the number of lobbyists that you guys have on less than one hand. And he pointed out that our lobbyists are like the same ones who've been doing it for 20 years. So he sort of pointed out like that there's not kind of this like emerging generation, but also that that we don't have a presence in DC by kind of the lobbyists, right? And so he was like, on other issues, when you don't have that presence in DC from the lobbyists, you have the letters, you have the phone calls, you have that groundswell, so that we can't forget about you. And what he said was, you want us to, he's like, you guys, come here once a year when you want something, and then you expect us to kind of carry the agenda for the rest of the year, but we don't, you don't provide us like that political will and that political cover, right? So I just want to sort of throw back to you, what will it take? How do you create that? And do you, specifically for immigrants' rights, do we work on sort of building that broader human rights constituency, or do we focus on like an immigrant rights constituency? I hope that question is clear. Yeah.
Well, from our perspective, we build it house by house, neighborhood by neighborhood. Like I said before, we have right now in May, we had been working with day laborers for about 9 years. So we knew what we could do with one work center. We could actually organize a whole community. But we had never done it massively. Now we have about 15 communities organized with, between 20 to 30 families in each one of those communities. And basically, one of the things is that we tell people that are undocumented, quote unquote, that they do have power. They're not powerless because their employers want them there, and their employers usually are U.S. citizens. They have relatives. If you raise your hand and in a Latino community said, how many of you know a U.S. citizen? They all raise their hand. How many of you know at least 10 U.S. citizens? About half of them raise their hand. So you guys you can actually become a lobbyist. You can promote it. You can move it. And the thing is, many times what happens is you have the brokers, what I call the brokers, and I don't know if I'm going to offend anybody, but the rifa types that go up there and then they talk for us without ever talking to us, and at the same time go and promote criminalization in Congress without ever consulting with us, saying that it's okay to criminalize 5 million people if 3 or 4 million go through. And those are the people that are in Washington all the time. Through the Endelon, we actually have our own lobbyists. So yeah, we can do it. But the thing is, it takes a lot of work, and it has to be that work from the bottom up.
Just to follow up on your point, we had similar experience. I mean, we were told if we don't provide a list of voters to speak on the issue, then, the constituency is not there. But just picking up on your point, I mean, in order to organize, first of all, you have to speak with one voice. And within the immigrant movement right now, there are different voices and different forces and tensions, so to speak. So you mentioned that we don't want to hear about the criminalization and the Reform for America, the national campaign that, many states, 35 states, and over 400 organizations are part of. It's struggling with the fact that what kind of a language do we use? Politicians don't want to hear, legalization. And every time that they talk about that, it's amnesty or borders. And the struggle is how to create a message to make more friends and go beyond the immigrant constituency. And sometimes the enforcement language attracts people. That the issue of border, it's a sensitive issue, an emotional issue for everyone. So those, first of all, the organizing and the message should unify the movement. Then, it should go beyond the, those who benefit directly. And part of the tension really makes it very difficult to organize the voters and to get a strong consistency. But I think the answer is organizing the voters, educating the voters, and the immigrant bloc to be unified. It's extremely important. Mira, a couple of years ago, incorporated the 501c4, which is called the Coalition for New Americans. And the purpose of this new coalition, to do political work is to really organize the immigrant base, educate the voters, and make sure that they go to the polls. And I'm proud to say that only in the last few months, we registered 2,600 new Americans who promise that will get to the polls and will vote. So organizing, as you said, it's key, and education is key, but the messaging is also important to address, what the politicians need to get those votes done.
You want to go ahead and answer? And I just wanted you to, in extending that question specifically to you, Michael, if you can reflect on, in your work in the CRPD, was it very sort of technical advising on legal language? Were there constituencies involved? Is it true that there is or isn't a presence for that effort in BC?
I was actually going to answer first the question, which is, and I'll get in more trouble than Reza. Large parts of this country are extremely short-sighted and extremely selfish, and you just have to look at the number of SUVs outside and the fact that President Obama has a 40% approval rating and other things to realize that. And unfortunately, I think in the short run, in addition to the political power of organizing and creating a beachhead on pushing these politicians, unfortunately, we haven't made the argument that in this global economy, we need to be bringing the brains and the resources and the energy and to this country rather than having them leave this country. And in other places, for example, the Ontario Human Rights Commission in Canada was doing work on tracking who the immigrants were and whether, in fact, they were working up to their capabilities. Because they had a huge number of influx from Southeast Asia and people with degrees and advanced degrees, and they were working as cleaners and other domestics, and then they would leave. And so, unfortunately, I think in the short term, it's thinking about resources and about why immigrants add to the country, which I think is something we ought not to have to show, but in the short term, I think is something to do. Longer term, it would be nice if the country thought about being a global citizen, and immigrants are coming from other parts of the globe, and why it is part of global community to exchange individuals and ideas. As far as the CRPD, the whole driving force behind it was participation. It was the first time in UN history that the targeted group was there, meaning, of course, there were women during the CEDAW negotiations, but there were no women's NGOs who were able to do interventions. And therefore, that's why this treaty was the fastest negotiated. It's the one that, in its provisions, calls for participation. And yet, when it comes to indigenous groups, they ran out of money after the third ad hoc, about a third of the way through the negotiations. And so if you look at the treaty itself, you'll see that although the indigenous groups are mentioned in the preamble, when it comes to the rest of the treaty as far as language, use of expression, freedom of expression, political participation, accessibility, indigenous rights are not as highlighted as they ought to be. So coming back full force, it has to do with participation and with being involved at all elements and all levels of the political process.
I'm going to try to comment really concisely on this. So I was an organizer for about 15 years before I went to journalism school. And if you had told me then that today I would be doing a campaign on some language, on some word, I would have said, you are absolutely insane. Like, that's useless. I would never be doing that. I actually think we need to step away from the legislative and technical fights because the reason we don't have a constituency is for the reasons that Michael mentioned. And I think there is a silent majority, both of immigrants and of U.S. citizens, but it's too silent. It has to speak. And I think the reason that it cannot speak is because we've spent too much time, or the proportions of time have been so heavily weighted toward the technical policy issues that most people just do not understand and cannot follow and don't have any interest in. So we have to make a link between how race, that is my frame, how race, immigration, human rights are legislated and how those things are actually lived. And what is going to activate people who are not already going to DC once a year, because we have to grow that constituency, is an understanding and an investment in how these issues get lived, not in how they get legislated. The legislated part is going to come after people have an investment in how I live this set of values that I have. And that really, that's tactically, that's about knocking on doors and voting and things like that, but it's also about triggering a competing frame in people's heads. That's not the dominant border-oriented frame. Triggering a we're all in it together frame, it's one world frame. It's there, but it's teeny in comparison to the other. And we have to have the resources and the will to work on that part of things, and not just on what we already know how to do, even though we haven't been succeeding. I think it's a really new arena for the movement, but if we don't go there, then that majority is going to remain silent.
Can I just say one thing briefly? I'm sorry. Go ahead. If you want. Again, I don't want to sound like somebody who's opposed to organizing and activism and all of these fronts that people have been focusing on, and I myself am engaged in it. I mean, I'm not quite certain that I will die ever realizing many of these battles, but that's part of what life is. But I think back, for example, look, I went to school in the 60s. My parents were thrown in a concentration camp. And I'll tell you, a lot of us who are children of those people who were in the American concentration camps You know, we're all activists about the Vietnam War and so forth, and we said about our parents, we were ashamed of our parents. Like, how could they go into those concentration camps in the way they did and not resist and fight and organize? And, you know, how did they go in? Now, part of the narrative is that many did. But I was ashamed. I said, why didn't they organize? How did they allow them to be taken in and marched into those concentration camps, you know, for who they were? But I think about the situation of those individuals. You're right, they were all human beings. But there are people who are human beings who occupy the dark side, as we've used the term. I'm sorry, I believe that. And there are powerful forces out there. I know there are the powerful forces of organizing and right and appeal and all. I understand that, and I hope they win. I want to be wrong. But I also understand that there are powerful forces, and the ballot box is a force. But there are other powerful forces. There are resources. There is the message. There's Fox News. There's the way I'm saying these are real powerful forces that are out there. And believe me, they wanted those people in those concentration camps for reasons that had nothing to do with national security. And so for me, to some extent, I look at my father who was undocumented. Why didn't my father resist? Why didn't he stand up? Why didn't he insist on various sorts of things? Look, if he would have said anything until 1970s, he would have been squashed. He would have been crushed. Again, my point is not to organize and so forth. But I think there are powerful forces out there, too, that everything we want, they oppose. And there are example after example of that. We've all talked about it. We all see them. Those 33,000 people that go to bed in detention tonight know it.
I want to take several questions from the audience and then bring it back to the panel. So you had your hand up before?
A lot of this discussion is making me think back to the New Bedford raids that happened here a few years ago on the messaging and the media. Many of the people picked up in the raid were indigenous Maya from Guatemala. And their rhetoric was partially, look, we're not immigrants. You know, we're native people. Our people were in this continent before any of your people were. So what are you telling us that we're undocumented and you're going to deport us? What is this all about? And whenever you say things like that, or when, you know, Mexicans say things like, you know, your border didn't cross, we didn't cross your border crossed us, the media, they roll their eyes. They do not give any validity to those sentiments, while at the same time giving validity to the most xenophobic, you know, extreme views on the right. Things like, you know, if you're born in the U.S., you don't need to be a citizen. You know, you're not necessarily a U.S. citizen just because you're born here. Why is that? And can we, you know, somehow move the debate a little to the center by giving validity to the other voices on the other side?
We're going to do a few questions and then go back to the panel.
So I guess this does get to the last question as well as to what Paul was raising and others have raised on the panel, is not the question of why the media doesn't give voice to those other voices, but why we aren't talking about accumulating power. Because it seems to me that what a lot of people are talking about is the lack of power. And so I'd love to hear more from the panelists about strategies to build power as well as the voice for these issues.
Any questions on this side? You've been very quiet.
I'm not sure this is a question exactly, but I wanted to build on your earlier comment. And in a sense, I suppose, challenge the staffers' word to you. I was detailed to work on the judiciary at one point as a government person. And I don't know if that staffer didn't read his emails or didn't look at the facts, but information was constantly coming in on immigration issues and from a wide range of people who were advocating. it bothers me to some extent that the burden ends up being shifted back like that by a staffer who has the capacity, arguably, to lead more aggressively and to challenge the kinds of behavior that would chill someone from actually coming forward. And I'm reminded of a hearing that Zoe Lofgren held that had to do with a lot of young DREAM Act kids who got arrested, and chased down, and whose families were victimized because they testified. So that is something that you could challenge the staffer to take more aggressive, role in stopping. And that might be in the form of an oversight hearing, at ICE behavior or CBP behavior. So it isn't so simple, I don't think, to just kind of put it back and say, I can't represent X position because I'm not being handed a script, that equips me to go into a meeting that a high-level lobbyist for IBM might, send to me overnight. And I guess just the second piece on that is I do agree with the comment one of the panelists made about how we do need to speak in a certain kind of distilled maybe or clarified language, because it is a really, really complicated area. And part of what seems to have worked and continues to work is this divide and conquer mentality when it comes to immigration. So when you look at sort of a CIR piece that has 7 different, sections, and somebody's, supporting the DREAM Act part, but then they're pitted against the ag jobs or whatever, then it's a divide and conquer kind of thing. In one way that it seems people are suggesting you could kind of get past that is to settle on a common language, and maybe that's where the human rights piece comes in. But.
Let's go back to the panel and then do another round of questions.
To the question about that she asked about when people say, well, we're indigenous, and at the same time, that doesn't help with a mainstream type of people. In reality, that's the approach we have taken for a long time, and the approach has been to always cave in the language and always cave in to whatever the right wing wants, to the point that back in the Simpson-Rodino bill, they wanted to militarize the border, so everybody gave in on that. Then there came the Simpson-Masoli bill, then they gave in more. Now comes the SB 1070, they give in more. And the basic thing is that truth is the truth. And sometimes people don't want to hear the truth, and the truth is that those Mayas were right. They are protected under the Human Rights Declaration and the Declaration of the Indigenous Human Rights Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, and they do have the right to traverse their original lands under international treaty. That doesn't mean the U.S. respects it, but they do have that right. Now, how do we, change that around? I think the human rights frame is the only thing that can probably take us to that level, because we go beyond the civil rights into the human rights. We go beyond the national politics into more of a human rights approach. But it has to be more than that. It actually has to go to the point that we go and challenge the very corporate interests that have created the situation. Because don't make any mistake about it, this is a created situation that responds to global corporate interest. And unless we start analyzing that more profoundly, we're still going to be fighting Washington or fighting our state governments, which in essence, they're nothing more than nothing else but puppets. The puppeteers are the ones that are creating all of this.
Responses over here to questions?
I can do one to both of those questions. So I think it's important to split people off from the extremists. So, and not just in legislative fights, but in the culture. So, a quick story from Idaho, very white state, 95% white. I have colleagues there at the Idaho Community Action Network, and white. That's an organization of white, American Indian, and Latino people. And during the 2007 immigration round, there was this. They had a senatorial candidate who was Latino, but really, really anti-immigrant and really rabid. And they did this thing where they went to the local businesses and asked each of the businesses to put up a sign in their window that said, immigration is an American tradition, acceptance is an American value, something like that, and saying immigrants are always welcome here. And again, this is an organization that fights legislatively and on policy, but they could see we have to do something here to keep our community together because this guy is trying to split us off, and we have to give people a point of activity that's not his. So I think we have to be more creative about those kinds of things that are public. And I just want to point out that there's a difference between frames and messages. So frames are always large, they're always moral. Frames are the stories, images, myths, archetypes that signal a society's morals and its aspirations, its standards. And so, and messages frames would be constant, messages are what you would craft according to the fight and the moment. So you don't want to have your messages contradict your frames. That's one thing. So if your frame is immigrants are human beings, then your messages have to reinforce that, even if they also argue they're making economic contributions, also argue their human rights are being violated. I think part of the reason human rights, immigrant rights, even civil rights, they're a little bit limited as frames is because they're not actually emotional enough and they don't invoke a story. So that's why by using what is essentially really legalistic language, human rights, civil rights, those are legal frames. They're not universal story frames. That's where our work is. That's again, it's moving out of our technical comfort zones into an aspect of social psychology that most organizers, lawyers, are not that comfortable with, but that affects all of us in the context that we're in.
Just in terms of dynamic, I think we have to consider why we have baselines in this country of what is considered normal and then what deviates from the norm. And I think Paul's made this point really well, which is, since 9/11, we've been pushed so far to the right on expectations and dynamics that you can see that advocating for people to have basic health care is considered something dramatic and unacceptable, or advocating for children not to be separated from their parents, right, in terms of immigration is considered something dramatic and unacceptable. And just if you need another example of this, think about some of the rhetoric around the time when Elena Kagan went to the Supreme Court. People were concerned that we wouldn't have any Protestants on the court. Consider that. We actually had discussion publicly about the need almost for affirmative action for Protestants in high levels of power. And I think that really says a lot about it.
Are there... Yes.
Here, thank you. I wanted to go back to Professor Watanabe's comment about the dark side. I think that organizing is necessary, but people have to come to terms with the fact that you have these two camps of people. You have a camp that is comprised of very needy people, people who have a need for justice and fairness, and they're not getting it, people who are devalued by the society, and people who have no respect, and they're all together, immigrants are part of that group. On the other side, you have a more tight-knit group made up of people who feel that their race is being compromised, they are religious, and there is this intense nationalism. And so they are more tightly focused on repelling whatever they see as this mishmash of people over there, including the immigrants. I would say what I see as a way out of this is to get white folk organized into being part of this immigrant movement. Until white folk become energized and see that the rest of us, the immigrants and the needy people and the people who are devalued, need help over here. Until that happens, the movement, they're going to mow us down, they're going to pass us by. Dogs are more respected and valued sometimes than these people over there.
Any other questions in the room? So then, oh, there is. Please go ahead.
Project, we can hear you.
Hi, okay. Oh, sorry. My question sort of goes along in some ways with the last comment, which is in thinking about solidarity organizing, ally organizing, I'm curious what sorts of messages you would suggest those white folks in the suburbs perhaps be projecting. A message I often hear from allies is, you know, these people are suffering, these people deserve better, something like that. A message I hear less often is, I don't want to live in a community that persecutes our fellow community members. I want my community to be accepting and welcoming. I'm wondering if a more personalized message, more self-interested ask of legislators would be more effective. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yep. If you can quickly throw it out there.
Well,
wrap up.
I like the idea of identifying enemies as well. One way to list people is your cause. Find people. Now, what is being, the role is being pulled over our lives. Those are the beneficiaries of xenophobia are in fact deeply harmed. You know, so I want to hear a little bit more some of this side. How do we take the veil off? Those who are in fact benefiting. How do we reveal that in a strong way to New York? Because I agree on the thing, and I said it yesterday, corporate power has a lot to say about this, but we almost never hear about corporate power when we talk about it. You know, it's just like off the map. Corporate power drives people here, doesn't treat them well when they get here, and sends them back home with the same bad conditions that they came.
And it's in the media as much as indigenous Mayans. Right. So just to then wrap it up, if we could have each panelist respond to what seems to be a strain of questions in a minute, is if you want to respond to, you know, your thoughts about how do you get the white folks on board with what message, who are the targets. I think this is very much a question about building power. So your 1 minute closing thought on that. Rinku.
You know, I'm sorry.
Rinku can start.
My 1 minute closing thought is that we have to engage beyond the people who already agree with us. And, you know, that takes intellectual and emotional wherewithal and resources. And so if you don't have it, you know, start your meditation practice, develop it, and just start. Just start by, I really think a lot of us just run from those conversations. The message is one thing, but just the engagement, the knowing, the experience will do more to move people than all the talk. You know, so you try to introduce the people you know who are resistant to undocumented people. Try to get them socializing. Engage in debates with people who are not with you, and you know, you'll have to toughen up to like manage it because it's hard, but we all do it, and there's something there that can happen. But if we don't engage, it's not going to happen.
Well, again, I think it's a great question, and I wish I had the answers. And again, I guess I am in a pessimistic mood because in some ways, I think, I just feel like the pain is so great that part of the movement has to be trying to make the pain as bearable as possible. I hate to put it that way, but and maybe I'm personalized because my mother is 92 and we're going through the same choices about what we do with the pain she's literally feeling. And in some ways, I don't think we're going, and again, I want to be wrong. But in some ways, a decision has to be made to put our resources as much as possible as making the pain as bearable as possible, because I think there's pain here and there's more pain to come. This is maybe after November, the pain is going to be more, not less. But I want to build on the ideas that people have.
Yes, the way we do it in Arizona is that we bring a lot of white folks and then get them arrested by Sheriff Joe, and then and then believe me, they change. It's a mind changer for them. No, I really thank all the people that went, especially the Universalists that went up there and got arrested massively. But the other thing is that how do you expose it? The prison industrial complex is a machine that is driving a lot of this. Jan Brewer's top 2 advisors are executives from the CCA. Sheriff Joe is in the 1819 floor of the Wells Fargo Bank, which is the biggest investor on the GEO group. They own prisons in Florence and prisons throughout the United States, and Guantanamo, and Abu Ghraib, and all over the place. So these guys, they have to be exposed for what they're doing. They're creating this system so that they can have profits, warehousing, quote-unquote, illegal aliens. And you have to be very blunt about it. You cannot be nice about it because it's the truth. And the thing is, once you expose that, mobilize to change that. You cannot only expose it. You might expose it all you want to. Who cares? You have to mobilize. We have a 2-year campaign against the Wells Fargo Bank. 2 years, every day. At one time, we had about 15 or 20 demonstrations throughout the United States against Wells Fargo Bank. It's hard to maintain, but locally we have been maintaining it. And that in itself has been what has brought a lot of consciousness to a lot of the judges, to a lot of the people in the downtown area that pass by every day to the demonstration and have to put up with Sheriff Joe. And also they begin to understand the whole complex. So how do you expose it? By action. How do you get people to participate? They participate when you create a movement. Without a movement, nobody's going to participate.
Just briefly, I would say education. I mean, you would be surprised that, legislators don't even know the ABCs of, immigration, never mind, taking the lead or being the voice on that. We're in the building every day, and sometimes we hear, and lawyers, most of them, how come that they don't apply for citizenship? What's the obstacle here? And there is this concept of, you either are a citizen or you are not, or undocumented, that they don't know, that in between there are many in legal status. So I would say it's going to take a long time, but one-on-one education and thoughtful education campaigns are number one. Number two, I would say, when we craft our message and when we talk about frames and messaging and try not to contradict, I think we have to recognize, the pain of the other side, because even though, they find a different way of expressing their anger, there is pain there too. We have to admit that, there is a very high unemployment. We went through recession, and it's a difficult time for everyone. So if we start to recognize that and build messages and build bridges between our community, I think we're on the right track.
I think a theme running through the other panelists, and one thing that we try to do is emphasize the enlightened self-interest. Having said that, it's not easy. Otherwise, the poor whites in the South who would suppress the African American community for many, many years, right? Even though they were in the exact same situation, would have come around to it. But I think ultimately it's pointing out as to why it's in everyone's best interest in building a country to have certain individuals not excluded and to include more. But that's a very oversimplification and very optimistic view.
Thank you very much. On your way out, to talk to the panelists, please pick up a drop the I word. All right? And thank you very much.